I'm so excited to be continuing our series in Romans this morning. And we've titled it Rooted. And I loved last week, Lewis spoke and he gave this illustration of a tree. And like Fernando mentioned, over August, we've had a bit of a break, a pause to reflect as we gear up for this new season where we've got all these new meetings taking place. And I guess the hope for this series, Rooted, is that we cover these foundations, like the foundational principles of our faith that keep us strong and rooted when the winds and the storms of life come at us. So this morning, we're going to be looking at being rooted in hope. And I wanted to start with a question, and that's what comes to your mind when you think of the word hope? I think the world can tell us to root our hope in all kinds of different things. I'm 28 years old, which might seem very old to some of you and very young to others. But over the last 28 years, I've rooted my hope in all kinds of different things. Some of those things have come true, some still might come true, and some never will. I'd hoped to become a journalist, which I kind of semi-achieved. I got to do some amazing things with my job as a journalist. But I also hoped to meet the man of my dreams when I went to college, and then when I went to uni, and then when I moved to London 4 years ago. And I still haven't met him yet. I'd hoped that maybe I'd even have a kid or two by the time I turned 30, but it's not looking likely. It's really good to have healthy hopes and dreams for your life. But these kinds of hopes and dreams that I've mentioned, and maybe some that have popped into your mind as I've been speaking, aren't dreams and aren't hopes that last forever. They aren't hopes that last into eternity. And so this morning we're going to be looking at the type of hope we can root ourselves in that isn't fleeting and lasts forever. So as followers of Jesus, our ultimate hope is in the resurrection, when we'll be given a new eternal home in heaven with Christ. And that means that the place that we dwell now, which is earth, isn't our forever home. We're just passing through it. And if there's one thing I want you to take from this talk, hopefully you'll take away more than one thing. But if there was one thing I want you to take away, it's that this is not the end. This is not it. I don't know if you've ever been camping, but last month a few of us went to Focus. And I try and make my tent as glamorous and gorgeous as possible. I think we have a picture. That's my lovely tent. I wasn't just in there by myself, but this was the first night while I was by myself. I tried to make it as comfortable as possible. But after a few nights, maybe actually just one night, the novelty quickly wears off. I'm desperate to get home. Oh, that's lovely. Everything feels a bit off. My dad calls these kinds of holidays home appreciation holidays, when you return ready and longing to be back in your real home. And honestly, as I was reflecting on this talk, I thought that was such a great analogy for our time here on earth as Christians. Once we come into relationship with Jesus, something in our spirit just knows that something's off. This isn't where we belong. This isn't our home. We live in the discomfort of a broken world while we wait for the day that we're reunited with Jesus. So this morning, we're going to turn to Romans 8, verses 18 to 25. If you have a Bible, there's one behind your seat, and if not, it will come up on the screens. I've forgotten my Bible, so I'm just going to read from the screen. So it says, I consider that our present sufferings are not worth comparing to the future glory that will be revealed in us. For the creation waits in eager expectation for the children of God to be revealed. For the creation was subjected to frustration, not by its own choice, but by the will of the one who subjected it, in hope that the creation itself will be liberated from its bondage to decay and brought into the freedom and glory of the children of God. We know that the whole of creation has been groaning in the pains of childbirth right up to the present time. Not only so, but we ourselves who have the first fruits of the Spirit groan inwardly as we wait eagerly for our adoption to sonship, the redemption of our bodies. For in this hope we were saved, but hope that is seen is no hope at all. Who hopes for what they already have? But if we hope for what we do not yet have, we wait for it patiently. I love these verses because they're speaking about this in-between time where we're waiting to be reunited with Jesus in heaven, but we're still living on earth. But we catch glimpses of God's glory. And I don't know if you know much about Paul, who wrote this book, but he is not someone that is speaking from a place of comfort. Paul's been shipwrecked, beaten, imprisoned, and stoned. So he's lived a life of suffering. So when he talks about having hope in the midst of suffering, he's talking from lived experience. This morning, I want to share 3 points of how we can wait in this hope that lasts for eternity. So the first point is to wait with expectation. The second point is to wait with anticipation. And the third point is to wait with adoration. So let's start with the first point, waiting with expectation. In Romans 8, verse 18, it says, I consider that our present sufferings are not worth comparing with the glory that will be revealed in us. So in this, like I mentioned earlier, Paul acknowledges suffering. He doesn't downplay it, but he invites us to view suffering through this lens of eternity. I got baptized when I was 16 years old, and I kind of saw it as the end of a race, like, oh, congratulations, you've been baptized. And I thought maybe I'd be handed this pair of like godly goggles that would help me to see everything through this like lens of God. Like I would understand suffering, I would understand why certain things happened in our life. But unfortunately that didn't happen, as I'm sure many of you have also experienced. And actually coming into relationship with God meant that I was somehow more aware of the suffering and the pain in the world. If anything, whether you're looking at your own life or looking at the lives of others around you or looking at social media, it becomes painfully obvious that things aren't the way that God created them to be. But here Paul is reminding us that until we enter heaven, there will be pain. He goes on to say in verse 22 that the whole of creation has been groaning in the pains of childbirth. Once you come into relationship with God, like Lewis said last week, you get handed this hope that your life does not end at the grave anymore. But with this new hope comes a discomfort with the way that things currently are, and our souls long for things to be as God created them to be. I haven't had any children yet, like I mentioned, but Paul equates it with the pains of childbirth. So when a mum is growing a child in her stomach and she's going through the growing pains and the morning sickness and all the other things that come with growing a whole entire human inside of you, the only thing that gets mums through it is knowing that there's going to be a baby, on the hope of something on the other side. And that's a bit like what it's like for us living on earth. We get through it, we can get through the suffering knowing that we have this hope on the other side. And that's not to trivialize what we go through here on earth. Like I mentioned before, Paul had gone through some pretty horrific things. But if anything, it magnifies the glory that can be found on the other side. So how does waiting with expectation that things won't always be easy help us to be rooted in this kind of hope? Well, when we acknowledge that this isn't our forever home, when we expect that troubles will come, we know this isn't our final destination, and it gives us a different perspective. I was really struggling with this recently. Everywhere I looked, in my friendship groups, in my own life, in the news, every time I looked on social media, I just saw so much sadness and so much hurt and so much pain. And I found myself asking, like, God, where are you? Like, why is it so easy to see all of the pain and all of the destruction? And at this time when I was wrestling with him, I was going on a girls' trip. I was on a flight and I was looking out the window. I got a window seat, hallelujah. And like you do when you're going through a time of distress, I was gazing out the window, feeling really sorry for myself. And I realized that I felt God give me this fresh perspective, like a mental fresh perspective and a physical fresh perspective. And I had those words that I mentioned earlier just pop into my head, like, this is not the end. This is not it. Nothing in that moment changed. The circumstances were still the same. But when we fix our eyes on heaven, our perspective shifts and we can understand that this is not it. This is not the end. The enemy loves to use suffering to cloud our vision. And sometimes if we aren't rooting our hope in the right places, it can feel all-consuming and be overwhelming. As I was reflecting on this, I was thinking, like, if we're frustrated by how the world is now, and if we're frustrated by what we see, how much more so is God who created it? That's why he had to give his son, like we were talking about earlier, and that's why he sent his son as the solution. Tim Keller once wrote, while other worldviews lead us to sit in the midst of life's joys, foreseeing the coming sorrows, Christianity empowers its people to sit in the midst of life's sorrows, tasting the coming joy. And maybe this morning you're feeling a bit like I was. You're struggling to see the hope in the season that you're in. Maybe things haven't gone as planned and you're asking those same questions. Well, here Paul is reminding us that it's actually okay to acknowledge the suffering that you're going through. It's okay to let out a few groans and to feel the pain of it. But we mustn't lose hope, and we mustn't root our hope in things that are temporary. We have to root our hope in the fact that one day Jesus will make everything as it was meant to be, that one day we'll be reunited with him. The second point, so firstly we had wait with expectation. The second point is to wait with anticipation. In verse 23 it says, we ourselves, that's us, church, who have the first fruits of the Spirit, groan inwardly as we eagerly await for our adoption to sonship. So how do we wait with a joy-filled anticipation during the suffering? Well, waiting with anticipation is different than just waiting it out. It's not just succumbing to a fallen world and just willing the days away. We can actually enjoy our time in the waiting. We often talk about faith bringing joy, and joy isn't just happiness that comes and goes, but our faith is joyful, it's energized, and it's alive because of the gift of the Holy Spirit. Spurgeon said, believers are not dependent on circumstances. Their joy comes not from what they have, but from what they are, not from what they enjoy, but from that which was suffered by their Lord. I don't know about you, but sometimes I get so caught up in the race of being a Christian that I lose sight of the finish line. I love adventuring with God, and I feel so blessed that he chooses to work through me. But sometimes I get so caught up with what he's doing here on earth, I actually lose sight of heaven and the whole point of my faith. Not great, but I'm working on it. I'm here serving at church, I'm helping to plan for the next Alpha, or I'm praying about God's plans and purpose for my life while I'm here, but I actually lose sight of the end goal of heaven. And being rooted in this hope that Paul is talking about means living a life of eagerly anticipating our return to our heavenly home and keeping that heavenly perspective. In Hebrews 12, verse 2, it says, for the joy set before him, Jesus endured the cross. Even in his suffering, Jesus kept his eyes on what was coming, and that's what sustained him, and that's what Paul's calling us to do too. So are we looking toward heaven with eager anticipation? When we fix our eyes on eternity with Jesus, it helps keep the trajectory of our lives on track. And it's anticipation, a joyful anticipation of what's ahead, that changes how we actually live in the present. Our assurance of what lies ahead means we can live radically different lives now. And I love the way that Jesus did this. Obviously, he was an amazing example of knowing exactly where he was going and where he had come from. And it radically altered the way that he lived. In John 13, verses 3 to 5, when Jesus stops to wash the disciples' feet, it says this. Jesus knew that the Father had put all things under his feet and that he had come from God and was returning to God. I just think that's so powerful, to live your life in a way that you know exactly where you came from and where you were going. And that's the kind of radical humility that comes from being rooted in this kind of hope. What would our community look like if we were rooted in hope with this kind of heavenly perspective and assurance? Something like Lydia, knowing that she'd come from God and was going to God, gave up her time freely to serve her neighbor. Or maybe Fernando, knowing he had come from God and was returning to God, gave generously to his community so God's glory could be revealed. Living with anticipation and assurance of what's to come enables us to live lightly, to hold on to everything of this world loosely because we know that something even better is on its way. So we live with expectation, we live with anticipation, and we live with adoration. In Romans 8:21, it says, creation will be liberated from its bondage to decay and brought into the freedom and glory of the children of God. And that's the hope that I was talking about, that's so much different to the hope that the world tells us to put, the things that the world tells us to put our hope in. Like, this hope is that we will be redeemed, that we will be brought into the glory of God, that we will be saved from bondage to decay and brought into this new freedom. It's such a joy that we've been given this hope, that even in the mess, even in the brokenness, even in the suffering that we go through, that we have this assurance that things are going to get better. Even in the best moments of your life, the ones that you wish you could bottle up and experience again and again, even those are just tiny glimpses of what's to come. And living with this kind of hope is such a gift. I don't know if you know any people that spend all their waking moments doing everything they can to try and make this one life the best. They put so much pressure on themselves with this like YOLO mentality. And maybe that's even you sitting here this morning, but then you're dealt a bad hand, or maybe you actually get everything you thought you ever wanted and you realize it's just not enough and life is actually still so short. The world around us that we are called to reach is in this bondage of death and decay, but we're being called out of it, to be reunited in glory as children of God, just like he intended. So practicing gratitude and adoration for what God has done for us and what he's calling us into changes our perspective and resets our sights on heaven. If you're struggling to find hope this morning, I find it really helpful to even just write a list of things that you're grateful for. And some days, the only things that you can actually put on that list is that this is not the end and that there is something better coming, that you are being redeemed from this world of death and decay into the hope and glory of a child of God. And even if that's the only things that you can write down, speak it over yourself because it will change your perspective. Even in our suffering, even when things don't look like we expected, even when we can't see how God will work things together for our good, we can give thanks to God that this is not the end. And if anything, the current suffering that we experience serves as a reminder of the glory that's to come. When I was in my tent at Focus last month, by the time when I said I'd got to the point, maybe 4 or 5 hours into the night, where I was like, okay, this is nice. The novelty's worn off. I was dehydrated. I was suffering from a lack of sleep. My blow-up bed had gone down like it always does. Everything was just a bit damp. But I didn't sit in that moment and think, maybe this is just how everything's going to be. I expected that this wasn't going to be as comfortable as my home, and I anticipated my return to my warm, dry, cozy bed. I embraced it for what it was, a temporary space in the in-between. So I just want to ask you all this morning, are we living each day like there is something more? Are we rooting ourselves in the hope of eternal life? Is the future glory that you're being called to what keeps you going when times get tough? And are you patiently and eagerly awaiting your adoption into your heavenly home? What would Christ Church look like if each one of us lived rooted in this hope of where we are going and who we belong to? Maybe we'd be less likely to waver when things get tough. We'd hold what God had given us a bit looser, knowing that something so much sweeter was to come. And maybe we'd even take off our own robes and humble ourselves to wash our neighbour's feet, even in the midst of our own suffering, knowing that this wasn't the end.